some dare call it conspiracy.
Welcome to the Some Dare Call It Conspiracy podcast, hosted by Brent Lee and Neil Sanders. After nearly 20 years exploring the world of conspiracy culture, we are taking our guests and listeners on a guided tour of the rabbit hole. Our mission? To discover where the truth lies.
Cutting through the grime. Darren Grimes reminds me of a haunted ventriloquist dummy, not just due to his remarkably similar appearance, but also due to the fact that he is a puppet manipulated by hidden hands. He's completely hollow, he's wooden, he's a mouthpiece for propagandists, and the words that come out of his head are almost certainly not his own. He's also similar to a ghost, in as much as most of what he does is fucking transparent. Grimes is a prominent presenter for dreadful, bigoted current affairs / far-right propaganda node, GB News. This might seem like an achievement to be proud of, but in reality, it's the journalistic equivalent of being an infected, pus-filled boil in the centre of a giant gelatinous arse. I recently stumbled across one of his broadcasts in the same way that you might stumble across a corpse whilst walking a dog, and the results were just as foul and unsettling. The thumbnail for the debate, hosted by Grimes, has the station's logo next to the headline, meaning that it says, GB News, you should be ashamed of yourselves. A rare moment of self-reflection, I thought, but no, and as I started to watch, I realised, like a girl cornered in Russell Brand's dressing room, that this was going to leave an extremely unpleasant taste in my mouth. Watching Grimes in action, I wonder if he's the offspring of a cartoon cat and the automated taxi driver Johnny Cab from the film Total Recall. He's all phosphorescent teeth, dead eyes and no talent, like an embittered children's entertainer at Butlin's holiday camp. In many ways, his look and demeanour is far better suited to a children's TV show than news, as he has the gravitas of a knitted teddy bear and the intellectual robustness of a balloon animal. Ironically though, a child's level of understanding perfectly suits the audience of GB News. But how did Darren drag himself up to the gutter? Well, before he became the Andrew Ridgeley of news presenters, he dallied with various other things. Despite his current right-wing populist views, he initially entered politics as an activist for the Liberal Democrats, doing so while studying fashion and business at university. At the time, he was extremely pro-EU, and a huge fan of the pro-EU leader of the Liberal Democrats, Charles Kennedy. However, as Darth Vader, Saruman, and James Corden have shown us, becoming evil can be extremely advantageous to your career, not to mention profitable. If you didn't like Grimes' principles, well, that was fine, because you had others. He's a bit of a political chameleon, and that's genuinely not a dig at his weird bulging bug eyes. The following year, 2016, Grimes helped form anti-EU, pro-Brexit organisation Believe. Believe was an offshoot of Vote Leave, the official campaign to leave the EU. Believe, like Vote Leave, was embroiled in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where data was hoarded and then sent to a Canadian firm, Aggregate IQ, in order to be analysed and used to create adverts that catered to the fears of its recipients. Aggregate IQ and Cambridge Analytica used this data, some of which was collected in very dodgy ways, to build profiles of people, their likes and dislikes, which was then exploited to make more effective propaganda, influencing people to vote Leave. An electoral commission fined Grimes £20,000 for his role in the scam. However, this was later overturned. In 2018, Grimes was appointed as digital manager for the IEA, a free market think tank closely connected to Koch Industries, Tufton Street, and the pro-Brexit crowd. The IEA is particularly keen on continuation of reliance on fossil fuels and the privatisation of the NHS to be replaced by an American insurance-based system. In 2019, he helped form Turning Point UK with the help of Candice Owens' husband and former Bullingdon Club member George Farmer. Turning Point UK is closely connected to Turning Point USA, who just so happened to be closely connected to Coke Industries. What a coincidence. GB News is also funded by the think tank named Legatum, who, by a strange turn of events, also happened to receive funding from Coke Industries and other billionaires. In 2020, Darren founded the website Reasoned, a platform that encouraged people to proudly embrace the views that have them labelled as racist, homophobic, or transphobic. Grimes, a gay man himself, provided the gossamer-thin justification for the idea that this wasn't simply a platform for hate, in the same way that Goering's cross-dressing provided an explanation that the Nazis were actually pretty progressive. He performs a similar role at GB News. They can't possibly be bigoted because, behold, a gay man. He's essentially camouflage for bastards. Reasoned released material that appeared to be copied word for word for similarly gross far-right outlet PragerU, coincidentally owned by fracking billionaires, the Wilkes brothers, who by chance are also connected to think tanks like the IEA and are fiercely opposed to environmentalism and equality for LGBT people or people of colour. In 2020, Grimes got himself added to the history books for helping derail the career of unpleasant historian David Starkey. The rise of Black Lives Matter had prompted a discussion on the slave trade, with Starkey claiming
slavery was not genocide, otherwise there wouldn't be so many damn blacks in Africa or in Britain, would there?
Sadly, this reprehensible outburst wasn't a game of things that your Nan, Enoch Powell or Donald Trump might say. It was his own despicable view. It is difficult to determine if Starkey was trying to say that slavery wasn't as bad as it was made out to be, or if he was saying that the violence against slaves didn't go far enough for his liking. One is forced to wonder if he recognises any genocides at all. I mean, the Rwandan genocide was pretty bad, but there are still Rwandans. The Holodomor left some Ukrainians still alive. The Khmer Rouge similarly failed in eradicating the entire Cambodian population. The fact that I have seen a Native American probably means that they should stop fucking whining, and Spielberg's very existence apparently negates the entire content of Schindler's List. Perhaps we should take Starkey's example and aggressively reappraise these historical events. With a track record of inciting homophobia, opposition to trans people, racism, and electoral interference, the path was obvious, and Grimes was offered a job at GB News. He began in 2022, but in November of that year, he abruptly left the channel, only to return in 2023. The reason for this absence was apparently that Grimes had decided to try and interfere in a decidedly more hands-on fashion. Specifically, this was described as the persistent sexual harassment of a junior straight male colleague. The station said that this abused member of staff was moved to another position for their own protection. However, it was later revealed that the safeguarding amounted to texting the employee to warn him whenever Grimes was in the building. In essence, his phone acting like the motion detector in the film Aliens, alerting him to the slimy, inhuman danger lurking in the corridors. Perhaps Predator would have been a more fitting film for a metaphor, but hey-ho. I suppose if these allegations are true, you could describe his attitude to immigration as Aliens versus Predator. Thank you, I'm here all week. As far as I'm aware, though, the staffer in question was able to avoid any close encounters, or indeed any abductions, or anal probes. Shortly after this, Grimes peaked, so to speak, and made his most eventful splash on the annals of history. After a bout of Grimes being particularly unpleasant on Twitter, a user named Warrants posted this now legendary stanza, which, shall we say, touched on something rather unpleasant. It said, "I think I've mentioned it on here before, but my cousin went to school with Darren Grimes, and everyone called him Crafty Wank because he was caught beating off under the desk in Year 9. Whether this incident was in any way seminal for Grimes is up for furious debate. Grimes responded to this with characteristic good humour and threatened the poster with legal action, allegedly stating, "I have emailed my lawyer and I have instructed him to prosecute you to the full extent of the law." The internet instinctively smelled blood, or at least something rather unpleasant, and responded the way that you would have done at school. They took this seed story to be completely true and began showering Darren in reminders of his own filth. Now, in all fairness, there is absolutely no evidence that the story is true, and even the messages threatening legal action have not been proved to be real. But Grimes is such a weaselly little shit that people reasoned it's the sort of thing that might have happened, and I want it to be true. Therefore, it became canon that Grimes had indeed blotted his copybook. Technically, this is bullying, although, as an advocate of free speech, Grimes is in the bizarre position where he should probably encourage it for fear of looking woke. Maybe he would even like to follow himself home and give himself a fucking good kicking. Despite the thumbnail saying, GB News, you should be ashamed of yourselves, the title of the debate hosted by Grimes is actually, you people are trying to smear his name. Darren Grimes fumes over lefty attacks on Nigel Farage. I'm surprised that Grimes hasn't insisted on removing words like smear that might remind viewers of his alleged scholastic, desk-based onanism. Good for him for rising above and standing proud. He should give himself a hand. It shows the lad has spunk. He doesn't give a toss. It's like he's wearing a helmet, the ball's in his court. You can't even glance him. He won't be shafted. He's grasped how to get on. He's got skin in the game. He'll go the length. He's churning out content hand over fist, which must be both gratifying and stimulating. He's had a right touch, but he's pulled himself together and he will palm away any bad feeling. I mean, sure, he's been bashed, but now he's flying solo. I mean, he's Han Solo. He's Obi-Wan Kenobi. And he refuses to be beaten down. Anyway, I'll stop bringing that up. Anyway, as we're edging towards this mass debate that Grimes is hosting, it promises to be gripping, so come. So Grimes appears on screen with all the comportment of a nervous supply teacher and says,
"Now though, it's time for our next debate. Who wants to go next?"
"Well, unfortunately, it's me,"
says a man who looks remarkably like Samwell Tarly from Game of Thrones, who is apparently named Benjamin Butterworth. This is the only person that the news ticker will identify throughout the segment. GB News is not the slickest of operations. There are Jackson Pollock paintings that are more organised than this deeply amateurish channel. I've seen cluster bomb attacks that are less chaotic than some of their broadcasts. Honestly, they make a parish church notice board look like fucking Reuters. Benjamin begins to talk about awful human being and far-right arsehole, the blisteringly inferior Nigel Farage. He appeared on Panorama recently, representing his similarly dreadful political party Reform, designed to sweep up those that felt that the soon-to-be outgoing dystopic nightmare that is the Tory party wasn't quite cruel enough to immigrants, hospital patients, or the poor. On the programme, Farage spouted literal Russian propaganda lines and claimed that the current Russian invasion of Ukraine was due to provocation from NATO, the EU, and the West in general. This has been condemned as inaccurate by politicians, military men, historians, and anyone that can follow a basic timeline in a newspaper, but strangely, GB News is keen to back him up. This may be because Richard Tice, a prominent member and former leader of the Reform Party, which was previously known as the Brexit Party, just so happens to work for GB News. Nigel Farage also just so happens to work for GB News, as does Reform member Lee Anderson. Just to give you an idea of the Reform Party, it was recently revealed that 42 of its members followed the leader of a UK fascist group on Twitter. Literally dozens of their members have been exposed as being racist, transphobic, or homophobic. I was going to list all of them, but honestly, it killed the mood and flow worse than the extended plantation scene in Apocalypse Now Redux. The shorthand is that they have more bastards than the life story of Elon Musk. Honestly, this party is an absolute razzle-stack. That might be a bit of an obscure reference. Basically, it means a big pile of cunts. Benjamin continues.
Now, I think that for a man that likes to parrot the lines of Churchill, he sounds a lot more like Neville Chamberlain trying to blame us for defending Ukraine.
He starts up a follow-up sentence.
Now, Darren...
And is immediately cut off by the unannounced VT of Farage on Panorama, being questioned by BBC reporter Nick Robinson.
We've provoked this war. Of course it's his fault. He's used what we've done
we
as an
provoked
excuse.
the invasion of Ukraine.
And very interestingly, once again, 10 years ago when I predicted this, by the way, I'm the only person in British politics that predicted what would happen. And of course, Everyone said I was a pariah for daring to suggest it. George Robertson, former Labour cabinet minister, who went on to become the Secretary General of NATO, has in the last couple of weeks said the war is a direct result of EU expansionism.
There is a bit to unpack there, so let's go through it. Farage says that the West provoked the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He then doubles down and repeats the claim. He then claims to have predicted the war would happen and was shunned for it. But now apparently the former Secretary General of NATO agrees with him and blames the EU. Since the show, he has further doubled down and even said that he refuses to apologise for what he said. Did we provoke the invasion? No, we didn't. Russia first invaded areas of Ukraine, namely the Crimea, in 2014, shortly after its puppet politician, Viktor Yanukovych, had been ousted from his former position as the president of Ukraine. Contrary to Russian propaganda, this was not a coup by the USA. It was a democratic process that came from the people of Ukraine, sick of being under the rule of an admitted Russian stooge. The same year, Russian troops entered the Donbass and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, reasoning that if they could not control Ukraine politically, then they would attempt to do so via the military. Prior to this, the last countries to join NATO were in 2009. Did Farage predict a war? No. In 2014, he stood up in the EU Parliament and warned the EU of poking the Russian bear. Sounds like he knew his stuff, yeah? No. You see, he made this speech after the invasion of Crimea, so there already was a war going on. He was just being a Russian apologist, even back then. Did George Robertson say that the war was a direct result of EU expansionism? No, he has publicly dismissed this notion. He did say that this Ukraine crisis started in 2014, when the Ukraine and EU signed an association agreement, and in fairness, he said that Putin used this as an excuse. But the blame lies solely with Putin and Russia, and Robertson also stated that Putin doesn't even really care about NATO expansion. He has even clarified that he doesn't think either NATO or EU expansionism was the cause or a provocation, and that Farage is parroting the Kremlin line. Also in 2014, Farage named Vladimir Putin as the world leader he most admired, though he clarified as an operator, not as a human being, misunderstanding that this is like praising the BTK killer for stealthily avoiding detection for so long. There are also questions that float in the ether about Farage's connection to RT, the news channel directed by the Kremlin. On GB News, for some reason, he lied and said that the UK government had seized the assets of certain Russian oligarchs. He was also formally bankrolled by fat wanker Aaron Banks, who has various alleged connections to Russian diamond mines and Cambridge Analytica. The entire Brexit campaign, which he was heavily influential in pushing, mostly with lies, has also been connected with a litany of rumours and evidences of Russian interference. Bizarrely, in 2018, he claimed to have never met the Russian ambassador, Alexander Yakovenko, despite meeting him 5 years previously and being photographed doing so. For some reason, Maria Zakharova from the Kremlin endorsed his campaign in Clacton. Christ, this is like a really shit Bond film. Farage has also appeared a number of times on the increasingly mental platform InfoWars. At the time, Alex Jones was remarkably seen as more sensible and less far-right than Farage, though it appears that he just hid it well. Comparisons to Mussolini probably should have extended beyond his growing belly and double chin. In 2009, Farage was promoting UKIP and complaining about the EU.
What's happening in the European Union is not happening in isolation.
He also complained about the British political elite,
because there's virtually nobody else in elected politics from Britain that has actually got the courage to stand up and say it.
Global government.
We have a political class across the world that are basically aiming for a form of global governance.
Global warming.
Governments are sitting around a table trying to sign us up to treaties on a very, very questionable concept of global warming caused by CO2 emissions.
And using crisis to take freedoms away from people.
What they do, of course, and it's a well-established technique, They try and use any crisis. Now, whether it's a real crisis or whether it's a crisis of their invention, they use the crisis to extend the argument for a loss of democracy, a loss of freedom of the individual, and the increase in global governance.
But he wasn't quite that savvy back then, and he revealed right at the start of the interview that he worked in the city, which technically is the enemy of the conspiracy crowd. Also, hilariously, Alex never once pronounces his name correctly.
Nigel Farage is a member of the European Union Parliament hailing from England. Go ahead, Mr. Farage. Nigel Farage. Mr. Farage. Nigel Farage is our guest.
Also, Farage implies that fear of Al-Qaeda and Muslim terrorists is manufactured to give the state power, which was incredibly popular with the conspiracy crowd back then, but is the mirror opposite of what he preaches now. In 2012, he goes on InfoWars again and tells an obviously fake story about a wealthy Greek friend buying an AK-47 machine gun in a back alley because of the breakdown of society.
Last week, I was in Brussels, and I got a request from a guy, could he come and see me? An elderly man in his middle-late 70s with a very distinguished career behind him. This guy had been a Greek ambassador to several major countries around the world, and he'd even, on behalf of the Greek government, negotiated, back in the early 1980s, Greece's membership of the European community. So I'm talking about somebody here who is a real establishment figure. And what he told me frightened the life out of me. He said to me, Nigel, I got to tell you that at the weekend, I went down to the back streets of Athens and I bought myself a Kalashnikov. And I looked at him and I sort of blinked a bit and thought, did I hear that right? He said, yes. He said, I got to tell you that myself and my friends, those of us that are comparatively well off, and we're all going down and for €100 buying Kalashnikovs because we believe the time is close when we're going to have to defend our property. So desperate are the ordinary poor people for food and possession. And when you think about, somebody of that social status who is so scared he's buying a Kalashnikov to defend his family, you realise that we've actually got in some of these countries, we are on the edge.
There's also a great back and forth where Alex tries to defend capitalism by describing the bad things that capitalism does, and then Farage calls it communism. Alex is also keen on asking Nigel's opinion of Ron Paul, who most people remember for calling Sacha Baron Cohen a queer who put a hit out on him. Farage is apparently a fan. Farage also predicts a number of countries leaving the EU, which you might remember never happened. He then criticises an Italian MEP for working for Goldman Sachs, despite himself being a broker in the city. It's a bit like being told to stop being racist by Hitler, in a couple of ways. Anyway, the point is that his whole persona is counterfeit. Farage has recently also promoted pimp and sex trafficker Andrew Tate in a transparent attempt to appeal to the youth market of idiots and date rapists. It reminded me of a joke about Andrew Tate. Andrew and Tristan Tate are sat talking about why they hate women. Well, you can't trust them. They're all liars, says Andrew. It started with Mum. She would constantly tell me that I was handsome, that I was going to break hearts, etc. But when push came to shove, no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried, no matter how much love I showed her, she wouldn't fuck me. Farage has also been accused of being a racist, homophobic, xenophobic prick with far-right and fascist sympathies. The crushing irony of his alleged love for the master race is that he himself is an absolute broken biscuit of a man. He's an unattractive, inadequate grotesque. He lacks any sense of style or panache, and his body looks like it's held together with bacon rinds and fag ash. The only thing he excels in is projecting his own incompetence and failing. He has a certain rough charisma, but this is only effective for those so destroyed by their own deficiency, for whom happiness and fulfillment is as alien a concept as the Klingons that they need to punch down and blame others just to cope with existence. It's technically Schadenfreude, but if you told them that, they would balk at the fact that the word sounds foreign. It cuts back to Benjamin in the studio, who is clearly talking, but there is no sound coming through. It jarringly cuts back in,
a great advocate for Nigel Farage's politics. Do you not think that this is deeply out of line with standing up for Britain and standing up for the West's interests?
Darren has a clear look of panic in his eyes. He's in over his head like some sort of bizarre tantric sex position and has the demeanour of a flustered mother complaining to a waiter for no good reason other than to make her daughter's hen do somehow about her. Grimes ejaculates, but luckily only in the speech sense and not in the knocking one out under the desk at school sense.
I don't at all, and frankly, I'm sick of seeing that clip played every hour on the hour.
So you think...
I mean, this is the topic of the show. The show that he's hosting, which has the tagline, "Did the West provoke Russia? Farage makes bold claim in Panorama interview." I think this complaining is simply due to the fact that Grimes realises that he's more out of his league than Captain Nemo in an airship. The camera then pans back to reveal the panel, and we never get to find out their names because GB News is such a ramshackle, unprofessional joke of an organisation that couldn't organise a bear-shitting competition in a wood full of laxatives. There's a fashionable hipster type that looks somewhat like Ned Flanders or Napoleon Dynamite's older brother, a woman who looks like she has wandered in from a garden party, a lad who looks like he works in a men's fashion shop, and Darren and Benjamin. And I'm somewhat distracted by the woman's polka dot dress. It's lovely and everything, but I can't help but notice that if you remove Grimes's head and put it on that body in that dress, it would look unsettlingly like Una Stubbs as Aunt Sally in the popular children's TV show Wurzel Gummidge. Honestly, have a look for yourself, it's absolutely uncanny. Also, the polka dot dress kind of reminds me of the supposed woman in a polka dot dress that may have aided Sirhan Sirhan in the assassination of RFK. For a brief moment, the vague possibility that Grimes might get shot cheers me up. Benjamin continues.
You think Putin invaded Russia because of what we and our allies did?
I think
He means Ukraine, and it's easy to misspeak sometimes, but the channel is so mediocre that stuff like this barely gets noticed and rarely gets corrected. Darren squawks.
I think I would listen to what Nigel Farage actually said, because I watched the full interview.
He beams with the pride of a child who finally managed to successfully negotiate a potty. The thing is, he's supposed to have watched it. As a presenter of a current affairs programme, it would be the absolute bare minimum to actually know the topic that you're going to discuss. This speaks to an appalling work ethic. You really have to read stuff in the news business. You can't simply spend all your time aggressively pursuing disinterested members of staff for sexual favours. I mean, I'm not saying that that is what happened. That's no way. I'm just saying that you shouldn't do that, especially, if you need to be learning a topic. The thing is, we've all seen it. You literally just showed us the clip in which Farage says, "We provoked this war." And when asked if that is his statement, insists, yes. It's more cut and dry than a Turkish barber's. But Darren isn't to be swayed, and he uses the tried and tested media technique of not answering the question, but answering a different question instead, and goes on.
I watched the full interview, and he said he disliked President Putin, and President Putin had actually been responsible for causing the war itself. I don't see how any part of what he said was part of apologism
through actions of NATO.
Well, says Grimes, flailing and out of his depth like Brian Jones. Then the lady from the garden party, whose name is never revealed, interjects.
We did break our promises to Putin. We promised that all of these countries around him... Let me finish, please. All these countries around him wouldn't be allowed to join NATO. They did. We didn't allow Putin to join NATO. Perhaps we should have done and kept our enemies close. All Nigel said was that we provoked him. He clearly said it was Putin's fault.
Yes, he did.
Says Darren, in a tone of voice that screams, "Yep, that'll do if we've got nothing better." Several things. Firstly, we did not break our promise to Putin. We, whoever that means, don't get to veto who joins NATO, and nor does Putin. She may be referring to Russian propaganda regarding former US Secretary of State James Baker and his statement, "not 1 inch eastward," which implies that the USA had a treaty to prevent other countries closer to Russia joining NATO. Baker was talking about East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Russia were concerned that the now unified Germany would have NATO troops and bases, and that their troops and infrastructure would come under threat. Baker's statement was to reassure that this would not happen. Following this, a treaty was reached where Russia was given huge sums of money to remove said troops and infrastructure, and large restrictions were put on any NATO presence in the former East Germany. So, to be clear, those talks and that statement was not about NATO expansion. It was about East Germany and its reunification into Germany as a whole. Former Russian President Gorbachev has himself confirmed that NATO was not discussed. In 2014, Gorbachev said that the assurance only pertained to East Germany and that the resulting agreement was upheld by NATO. His main aide in these negotiations, Eduard Shevardnadze, likewise agreed that NATO never made any such commitment regarding other countries in Eastern Europe, and that the question never came up in the talks on German reunification. Former Russian President Yeltsin did call the expansion of NATO illegal in 1993, but at that point, no one had joined for 10 years, Spain joining in 1982. It wasn't until 1999 and the 2000s that former Soviet states asked to join. President Clinton consistently refused Boris Yeltsin's offer to commit that no former Soviet republics would join NATO. He said, "I can't make commitments on behalf of NATO, and I'm not going to be in the position myself of vetoing NATO expansion with respect to any country, much less letting you or anyone else do so. NATO operates by consensus," he said. And he was right. USA or Russia don't get to control the actions of other countries. As for all these countries around him, Russia itself is so vast that it has 11 time zones. Only 11% of Russia's border is shared with a country in NATO. The NATO states are Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, and have all in the past been invaded and occupied by Russian or Soviet forces. Putin did ask to join NATO, sort of. He asked George Robertson, the man that Farage lied about earlier. He asked if Russia could join without going through the normal application process, and NATO said, "No, you can't do that. You can apply like everybody else." Russia refused and instead reached out to President Bush. Following this, a cooperation treaty was arranged between Russia and NATO, but since they never bothered to actually apply for full membership, it simply wasn't on the table. Also, she clearly forgets that she's supposed to be avoiding the question like Grimes, but she forgets this and admits all Nigel said was that we provoked him, which is exactly what he's being accused of saying, because he did. So she's totally wrong, but she's keen, and she continues.
This is being used as a tool against Farage because everyone's scared of him.
I have to pause here because my mind is flooded with images of all the tools that I would like to use against Nigel Farage. A claw hammer. A scythe. Combine harvester. Anyway, Grimes' eyes light up somewhat as he realises that this is enough to avoid the actual meat of the discussion. And he continues.
He's doing so well that, and people like you are so terrified by Nigel actually doing so well, and he's taken a lot of Labour votes in the Red Wall, and you people are trying to smear his name and call him an apologist for foreign regimes who wish us harm. That is absolute nonsense, and I think, frankly, you should be ashamed of yourself.
Benjamin doesn't like this at all and responds,
"Just because you're a fanboy of Nigel Farage, you will excuse any nonsense that he says."
Grimes is extremely defensive, mostly because that's a completely accurate representation of his toadying sycophantic attitude.
Nigel said this has given Vladimir Putin and the Russian hierarchy an excuse to turn to the Russian people and say, well, we needed to do this because of NATO's expansion.
Yeah, I mean, he did say that, but that's not the thing that we're talking about. And he's missing the point like an expert jouster. The nonsense thing is also the thing that this debate is actually about. The thing that he says on the ticker, the thing that you're supposed to be discussing, the thing that he said was that the invasion was due to provocation, which I might point out is a bit like blaming a rape victim for wearing a short skirt or being really pretty. So you do agree with Farage? We did provoke Russia, asks Benjamin. And Grimes realises that he's messed up, so he does the honourable thing and pretends that he didn't hear him. He allows the man, who looks a bit like Ned Flanders, to speak, but he very, very quickly regrets it.
We have to be honest here, which is that Putin simply did not need an excuse in order to invade Ukraine. And we saw actually this quite fascinatingly when Tucker Carlson went and interviewed Putin, and he set him up. He asked him this question. He said, why did you do this? Why did you invade? And he was expecting him to give the answer, as Farage gave, it's all about NATO. That's actually not what Putin said. Putin gave a warped view of history in which Ukraine does not exist. It literally, there is no Ukrainian people, and therefore it's part of Russia, and therefore Russia can invade. Now, completely factually incorrect, of course. There is a Ukrainian nation. The Ukrainian people deserve their right to self-determination. They deserve to be able to choose their own future. And to suggest anything otherwise, to suggest that their simple fact of showing interest in being part of NATO, being part of the West, was enough to justify Putin's action is just completely wrong.
He did. Game, set and match, I think. If only GB News were professional enough to tell me the guy's name. Grimes retorts,
he didn't say that. He said Russia used it as an excuse to justify it.
But the problem is that he did. You showed us less than 5 minutes ago. What are you, a fucking goldfish? Grimes turns to the man who looks like he works in a shop, who may be called Leo or Ben Leo or something, I didn't quite catch it, and he asks him if there should be a peace treaty simply because this has been going on for a while and is getting quite expensive, which is a bit like giving up your bathroom if squatters are just really, really determined. Darren has another dig at Benjamin.
People like Benjamin, dare I say, are being a bit naive on how long this can actually go on for.
He then hands the floor to Leo, or Ben or whatever his name is, clearly hoping for him to slam dunk the layup that you just flighted. But no. Instead, we get one of the most stupid exchanges I've ever seen on screen, and I recently watched Tucker Carlson interview Alex Jones. The man from the fashion shop opens with ill-founded confidence.
Yeah, I think we just need to grow up a bit and learn some nuance in the conversation. It's possible for one thing to exist at the same time as another.
Oh, he's Schrodinger's twat. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. He continues.
Putin can be a horrible tyrant, despot, dictator, and he can also, Nigel, can give the assessment that he has a perception that NATO was expanding too close to their borders.
So you do think we provoked him?
Did I say that?
Well, I'm trying to work out what you're just saying.
No, do you know what? I don't know enough about the situation to give comment.
Why the fucking hell are you here? Fuck me, that is so dumb that it gave me a migraine. I can only imagine his family sat at home, watching in expectation of their son's proud moment. Perhaps they've even told their friends and relatives that he's on the TV. Perhaps they're having a watch party, only for him to sully their family name so very comprehensively. I can imagine his father wondering how long he would have to cry tears of disappointment to provide enough to drown himself. I suspect he is strongly considering a bandsaw vasectomy in the shed, or at the very least setting fire to his testicles to cut this malevolently degenerate strain off at the source before it can do any more damage to the world. His mother, cursing her very insides and wistfully looking to her bedroom, where she knows that there's a wardrobe and there are plentiful supplies of coat hangers. But alas, it's far too late for all that now. Grimes, realising he's backed into a corner like a nest of tables, tries a new tactic.
Yes, but I don't want British people to be dragged into such a thing.
You appear to have just said that because it may go on for many years yet, that should affect whether we want to support them.
No.
Darren tries to pivot and ends up in a right mess.
I'm saying that there needs to be, I think actually Ukraine have been far too digging their heels in and saying we refuse to actually talk to the Russian state about what kind of peace settlement could be negotiated.
Now it's all unravelling. So you think, presumably, that they should give some land over?
I don't know. I don't know what...
Do you know what?
Believe it or not, I haven't got Putin's WhatsApp.
That people like you, who claim to have a monopoly on patriotism and Western values, actually think that a despot like Putin can invade a neighbouring country and then you should sit down and hand some land over. There is nothing defending the West about that attitude.
And that perfectly sums up the hypocrisy of the right wing. Let's not forget that one of Darren, GB News, and the right wing's biggest bugbear is asylum seekers trying to get into the UK. These are often characterised as men of fighting age. By Darren's logic, men of fighting age are acceptable and in fact allowed to seize territory as long as they turn it into a war zone. Let's take that even further. As far as I can see, what Darren is saying is that anyone who arrives in a boat or by any other means in the UK is allowed to stay and claim a plot of land, but only if they shoot someone before they're caught. If people arrive in a battleship rather than a dinghy, are we supposed to hand over Kent? I can only presume from following his reasoning that if Shamima Begum had garroted a man in a trench, then he would be pleading for her to have a council flat. This man is a twat. Also during this exchange, there was another VT error, and as Darren is talking, the picture freezes on Benjamin with his mouth wide open in shock, looking somewhat like a codfish and also somewhat like a cheap sex doll. But they're on damage control now, and the lady in the polka dot dress interjects. How do you think this war is going to end? And like the worst hostage negotiator ever, Darren shrieks, exactly how many people do you want to die? The lady, probably keen to get back to her glass of Pimm's, tries one last time.
No way this war is going to end without a negotiation that involves some land. We might not like it, we might not think it's the right thing, and we might not think a despot should be able to go in and do that. That's how this war is going to end.
Except this is not how things work. That would possibly be the end of that stage of the war. With one country occupied, why on earth would Putin stop? It can apparently be extremely Moorish being a megalomaniac. The man who looks a bit like Ned Flanders then totally takes her legs, sadly only metaphorically, by explaining calmly that all the things that she's saying should actually justify supporting Ukraine more and not less. Darren then swings for the fences with an absolutely ludicrous thought.
Well, hang on, Matthew.
His name's Matthew. We discover in the dying minutes of the debate that his name is Matthew.
Well, hang on, Matthew. Would you have said that about the Vietnam War?
Matthew responds with such powerful incredulity that it threatens to put a crease in his brain.
It's not a comparable situation.
But that goes massively over Darren's head like Erykah Badu's hat. Grimes says,
I think it is, because there were vast sums of money and actually troops being poured into that, and it was a losing battle all along.
Fuck me. His pattern recognition is off the chart. Can we get him a job at NASA or something? Matthew, clearly at a loss to deal with such violent stupidity, points out that if you want to avoid an extended conflict, the best thing to do would be to provide aid and assistance to Ukraine, which Grimes is also opposed to. Darren sighs loudly and looks like he knows he's defeated, but isn't quite bright enough to accurately assess the situation. He looks to the lady who says,
We can't undo the past, so where does it go now?
I hear the centre of the sun is quite nice this time of the year. Perhaps you could try there. Even Darren seems deflated by the vapidity of this statement and says,
OK, we'll have to leave that one there.
If only they would, I think. But as always, he's lying. And sadly, GB News was back on air the following day.